March 22nd, 1999. A terrified young woman runs naked through the streets of a small New Mexico town. She is the latest victim of David Parker Ray.
I would describe David as a serial sexual sadist, and really on the continuum of sex offenders, he would be considered a more rare type of offender.
It's less the committing of sexual acts. It's inflicting pain on them in any way that it can.
While these types of criminals often kill, and police are convinced Ray has killed, no bodies are found.
I've never had any question that David Parker Ray is a serial killer.
Without a body, prosecutors are forced to try Ray for crimes of sexual violence, many committed in a torture chamber he built and named the Toybox.
There are many prosecutors who tell you right out they would try 50 murder cases to every sexual assault case. It's a different kind of case.
So might Ray walk, despite overwhelming evidence against him, including audio tape?
Hello there. I'm going to tell you in detail why you have been kidnapped.
And videotape. And a victim's compelling testimony.
I didn't want to go to court. I didn't want to have to go face him. But I did it.
It would seem like an open and shut case. There was an awful lot of evidence.
In this hour, the David Parker Ray story and how his case put American justice on trial. Surrounded by desert, Truth or Consequences, New Mexico is a place where people go about their business with few questions asked. Named after a long-forgotten TV quiz show, it's the sort of town where Raymond Chandler might base a crime novel.
Truth or Consequences has kind of an undercurrent of criminal activity. We investigated a murder where a guy was stabbed 43 times. We had another murder where a guy beat his wife and put her in the trunk of the car and burned her in the car. This is just a community where strange and bizarre crimes occur.
On March 22nd, 1999, the local police received a call that would open a case far more shocking than anything they had seen before or have seen since.
911.
The call came from a panicked homeowner. A 21-year-old woman, hysterical with fear, burst into the caller's house totally nude, wearing only a metal dog collar and dragging a 6-foot chain.
I'm calling for a young lady that ran into the house. She says she's just been raped. She's got her chain on her and everything. Send someone right away.
So the officers arrive on the scene. Cynthia's telling them, don't let them get me. They kidnapped me. They tied me up. They raped me. The officers, of course, you know, who and where and all these questions are coming up in their minds. And sometimes it's really difficult to get answers from a frantic person.
The woman had a troubled past. She was a prostitute with a drug addiction. She claimed she was abducted by a client and driven to his house.
As far as when a police officer is called to an incident involving a prostitute, that's always in the officer's mind is what degree of credibility do I give this lady? Especially if it's a real bizarre story.
The house belonged to David Parker Ray, a 59-year-old mechanic who worked for the state of New Mexico Parks Department.
Cynthia said that she was on a bed in a kind of an expanded trailer house. She was naked, she was handcuffed, and she had a collar around her neck which was attached to a pole. She was given a bucket for a toilet. She was sexually assaulted. She repeatedly sexually assaulted. She was under the impression she was going to be killed, so she was desperate to get out.
Cynthia said that she was held in this house for 3 days. On the third day, a fight ensued. A lamp was broken. Cynthia then was able to escape out the back door of this residence.
Parker Ray and his girlfriend, Cindy Hendy, were both arrested and charged with numerous crimes, including sexual assault and kidnapping. the police obtained a search warrant.
Once they go inside the house, they find where Cynthia had been held in the sunken living room area. They see the bed, they see the pole, there's some chains and manacles there. There was obvious signs of a struggle and disarray in the room.
The search team also found a collection of sinister devices.
Go ahead and state your name for the record.
David Ray. David Parker Ray.
David Parker.
Ray claimed that the woman had agreed to a session of rough bondage.
Okay. Was she a willing participant, or did she not want to do it?
She was willing.
Okay.
At Ray's house, the police began a search of a seemingly innocuous white trailer in the backyard.
There was medical equipment and everywhere. Drills, modified drills with sexual devices on them and cages. I mean, it was just this unbelievable looking den. This was a torture chamber.
This torture chamber, dubbed the Toybox by Ray, showed a high level of ingenuity and how a human mind can go horribly astray. One of those called in on the case was FBI profiler Mary Ellen O'Toole.
The police and the other agents who were part of the task force really saw the Toybox as extremely unusual. In fact, they really initially did not know what to make of it. They didn't know what to call it. They didn't know what it meant. But the moment my FBI colleague Tom Neer and I walked in, the moment we walked in, we looked at each other and said, sexual sadism, this is exactly what this is.
A renowned authority on sexual sadism is Linda Fairstein, the former head of the Sex Crimes Unit for the Manhattan DA's office. She is now a best-selling crime novelist.
This kind of character is more interested in the suffering of his victims, and he becomes sexually aroused by their suffering. It's less the committing of sexual acts. It's inflicting pain on them in any way that he can. Now, often the ways that he does it resemble sexual acts, or he uses objects to perform sexual acts. So it's the criminal sexual arousal, but it's really caused by inflicting as much pain and suffering as he can on his victims.
Coming up, a new Toybox victim surfaces.
Before the FBI contacted me, I used to have nightmares of being tied to a table, or handcuffs, or duct tape scared me. But I could never put any of it together. And then when the FBI called, then I knew they weren't just dreams, nightmares, they were real.
With the prime suspect under arrest for sexual assault and kidnapping, and with the sexual torture chamber he called the Toybox revealed, everyone wanted to know who was David Parker Ray. By day, he worked for the state of New Mexico's Parks Department.
It's very typical that these sexual sadists wear two faces. These are because they're intelligent men, and that feeds the meticulous planning that they do. They're often able to hold jobs, appear in the community.
When I first met David, I walked into a very small county jail, and I saw him walking towards me in this orange jumpsuit. And he was very tall and lanky, and he looked very non-threatening, and he came up to me and he shook my hand. He was very polite. He was almost charming. He was gracious. He hung his head, said it was nice to meet me. And I kept having to tell myself, remember what you just saw. Remember that you just came out of a torture chamber that this person completely designed. And even for me, with the experience and background that I had, I kept looking at him thinking, no one would ever think that he is capable of what I just saw.
And this is David's truck right here, his original truck.
Ray was well respected for his mechanical ability. To those who knew him, he did not seem like a man who tortured and possibly killed women in his spare time, and he had no prior run-ins with the law.
He was just a real nice guy. He just real nice, real smart. He was always eager to help these other guys do things, around here.
But he also put his mechanical mind to nefarious purposes.
This looks like something that he would have made, and he has it labeled ankle spreader. He could get a woman in virtually any position that he wanted her in. She was his sex slave when they entered this trailer.
It was so interesting just to walk through it and look at virtually everything that was there, including the chair that was in the middle of the room, which had been customized so that it was like an operating room. You could pull on a levy and this would come down. You could pull on something else and this would be electrified.
This is not a rapist, for example, in a crime of opportunity who sees a victim, the thought appears to him, and he executes his crime. This is a man who had not only his home, but this trailer with a toy box, as he called it, with all the paraphernalia set up so that once he was able to lure his victim into this setting, he was able to accomplish everything he wanted to satisfy his desires. So smart in the sense that these guys are creative. They do a lot of planning before the event. They're very manipulative, able often to do the kind of talking that gets a victim who might not otherwise go with him into his clutches.
Ray's Toybox revealed detailed evidence of a long campaign of sadistic sexual violence.
The consensus was pretty clear that there were going to be additional victims here. For example, the utility trailer was taken apart virtually, and we collected trinkets, rings, necklaces, jewelry. They came from somebody.
Despite police appeals for more victims to come forward, the escaped 21-year-old woman remained the only known victim. But with her checkered past, her credibility might be questioned in court.
Somebody as methodical as David Parker Ray in planning this kind of case has picked his victims well. These are victims who are less likely to be believed if and when they get to a law enforcement person to tell their story. They are far less likely to be missed if they just disappear and are gone.
Police had a hunch that Ray would want to document his crimes.
It made sense to believe and was logical to deduce that there were videotapes somewhere. And many, many were found. There were probably 100, at least 100.
Maybe, just maybe, the tapes would lead police to a more credible witness. Most of the tapes contained little, but one had just what the police were hoping for.
You see a youngish, blonde-haired woman with David, strapped down naked. He's standing over top of her or kneeling next to her at all times. He's constantly touching her, and it's obvious that he's trying to get some kind of sexual gratification out of this. She appeared to be unconscious, or at least unresponsive to anything he was doing to her. This doesn't have any of the earmarks of a consensual encounter between two people who just enjoy this kind of behavior.
But who was the woman in the videotape? And was she alive?
We're looking at this videotape, and we need to know who this person is. He moves her leg at one point, and what's exposed on her right calf, on the outside of her right calf, is a tattoo. And you can see it in the video, but it's not clear, and it looks like a pretty, it looked like a pretty big tattoo. So we took this tape to the FBI to have it enhanced. Once the image was enhanced, we provided that to the media. Very shortly afterwards, a woman came forward and said, "That's my tattoo. That's me."
That tattoo I have is unique. Nobody else has it.
Kelly Van Cleve was a 25-year-old child care worker who knew Ray's daughter, Jessie. But she had no recollections of ever going to Ray's house, and no idea why the FBI had a picture of her tattoo.
They told me that it came off of a video they found in David's house. Toybox, as they called it. It was weird. And I was scared.
Initially, it was clear that she was having difficulty remembering everything that had happened to her in the utility trailer and in her experience with David.
Before the FBI contacted me, I used to have nightmares of being tied to a table or handcuffs or duct tape scared me. But I could never put any of it together. And then when the FBI called, then I knew they weren't just dreams, nightmares. They were real.
Kelly was struggling to remember what Ray had done to her, but the police soon made another chilling discovery in Ray's house, an audio tape recording.
Hello there, bitch. I'm going to tell you in detail why you have been kidnapped, what's going to happen to you.
This was sinister stuff.
Now, you are obviously here against your will. You're going to be kept chained in a variety of different positions.
The tape then revealed the reason for Kelly's lack of memory.
You're going to be drugged up real heavy with a combination of sodium pentothal and phenobarbital. You're not going to remember a thing about this little adventure or what has happened to you.
He had the right drugs. He had drugs that were fast-acting, that caused amnesia, that relaxed the victims enough. That's the intention of them.
Maybe it explains some of the things that were done to me. Being tied down and how uncomfortable you're going to feel and being used as a sex slave.
Ray released Kelly after 3 days, confident that the potent drugs would erase her dark memories.
It was very risky behavior on his part, and he felt confident that even though he did let them go, they would not remember the incident, and that's in fact true.
Coming up, police become convinced they have a serial killer on their hands.
I won't have any qualms at all about slicing your throat.
If you believe what David says on the tape is true, that he rapes and tortures women, there's no reason not to believe the other parts about killing women and disposing of their bodies is also true.
In building their case against criminal sexual sadist David Parker Ray, the New Mexico police had two key witnesses. One, a prostitute who had willingly gone to his house. The other, a woman, Kelly Van Cleve, who was drugged and could recall little of what happened. But as the police questioned Van Cleve, her memories began to resurface, slowly.
When he was in there for a long time. I was scared. I remember telling him that I wanted to go home. I didn't know if he was going to kill me or not. I remember him using different kinds of toys on me. And they hurt. That's about all I remember.
The police now had a credible witness, but maybe not one who could put Ray behind bars.
Potential weakness that she had, she didn't remember certain things. She didn't have a clear recollection of others. And that weakens the case and the overall picture that the jury is going to be given of exactly what David was up to.
The prosecution needed more witnesses, and Ray's own admission on his audio tape revealed there were others, many others.
As of the time this tape was made, I've taken 37 women for these purposes. Hell, maybe more by now.
For the egregiousness of these crimes, it's amazing to think this man had never been arrested, not even as much as a traffic ticket. But he had been engaged in these kinds of behavior, sexual sadism, criminal sexual sadist with non-consenting victims. He had been engaged in kidnapping and torturing women for probably close to 40 years.
With so many victims unaccounted for, at least 37 by Ray's own count, there was growing concern that Ray may be a prolific serial killer.
that you are expendable. It may sound harsh and cold, but I won't have any qualms at all about slicing your throat.
Death was a constantly resurfacing idea from David, not from us, but from David in his writings and his drawings and his tapes. Everything revolved around death. I've never had any question that David Parker Ray is a serial killer. There's never been a doubt in my mind about it.
But according to FBI profiler Mary Ellen O'Toole, murder was not Ray's chief objective.
Serial sexual sadist, by definition, wants his victims to be alive, because the definition of sadism is that they are sexually aroused by the victim's response to the infliction of physical or emotional pain. So the victim can't be dead. However, by almost default, by the torture process itself, a victim could die.
If Ray was a serial killer, he picked the perfect place as home base. His house was on the shores of Elephant Butte Lake, some 43 miles long and 200 feet deep. It's the largest body of water in New Mexico.
There was a map that we recovered in David Parker Ray's house that was just a map of the lake with X's on it. David had a sailboat, a large skiff sailing boat with depth-finding equipment, and he knew that lake very, very well, and he knew where the deepest places in that lake were.
I was hoping that we were going to have a body. I was praying that we were going to have a body.
There were overall between 2 and 3 full dive missions that were performed there without being able to locate any evidence that we could connect definitively to the Parker Ray investigation.
David had the perfect job if he wants to hide bodies or whatever. He had access to every nook and cranny of Elephant Butte State Park. He had access to areas that are kept under lock and key, that keep the public away from, but to which he had access.
Despite compelling evidence, the state's rape and kidnapping case against David Parker Ray had problems. The best witness had a patchy memory, and unless bodies could be found somehow, somewhere, there was a chance that justice might be denied. Coming up, an accomplice of David Parker Ray confesses to murder.
How did you come up with the idea to kill Marie?
That was David Ray Parker's idea.
Police had now identified 2 key living victims of David Parker Ray's Toybox, but they believed there were many more victims, most likely dead, somewhere in or under the New Mexico desert or at the bottom of nearby Elephant Butte Lake. But no bodies had yet been found, and the prosecutor's rape and kidnapping case against Ray was on shaky ground. The good news for investigators was that one of his victims, Kelly Van Cleve, was recalling more and more of what had happened to her. In July 1996, she had been abducted from this once bustling bar on the outskirts of Truth or Consequences, New Mexico.
We rounded up a bunch of friends and went bar hopping, and this is where we ended up. We always ended up here. No matter where we started, this is where we quit. And at the end of the evening, it was just me and Jessie. Jessie Ray, David's daughter.
Jessie Ray had told Kelly she would give her a lift home. Instead, she drove Kelly to her father's house.
The fact that it was his own daughter kidnapping just shows the depth of his resolve when it came to this behavior, and also showed his lack of emotional involvement with just about anybody or anything.
It's much more common for sexual sadists to work alone. They tend to isolate themselves. They've got a separate space, whether it's an apartment, a trailer, a whole separate space where they do their bad things. So it's unusual for them, in the overwhelming number of cases, to have co-defendants, partners. I find it very unusual that a daughter, a grown adult daughter, was one of David Parker Ray's accomplices.
I just remember being on her couch, her dad's couch. That's when they held the knife to my throat and put the dog collar on, the duct tape, the handcuffs. And I ended up tied to a table.
Jesse, you have anything to say this morning?
Kelly's testimony led to another arrest of Jessie Ray for her role in Kelly's abduction. And it wasn't the only time a young woman had gone missing from that bar. In July 1997, 1 year after Kelly's abduction, another friend of Jessie's, Marie Parker, also disappeared from the same bar.
It was almost midnight. She said she was going to go home and check on her kids. She'd be right back. By the time the bar closed at 2 o'clock, she still wasn't there and her car was still there, so. But somebody said Jessie followed Marie out.
No one heard from Marie Parker again. She was 21.
She had 2 little girls. There was no way she was going to leave her kids. So I knew something had happened.
For authorities, the similarities between Kelly's abduction and Marie's disappearance did not seem merely coincidental.
You ever heard of a woman named Marie Parker?
Not really, no.
She's a woman that disappeared about 2 years ago. And I just thought I'd ask, since I had the opportunity, I'd ask, see if you had any information that you could provide me with that.
With Marie Parker, we knew he was involved, but we didn't have enough information or evidence to pin anything on him.
She's the one that disappeared from one of the bars?
Yes, sir. You know anything about that?
I know of the incident, that's all.
You weren't a part of that by chance?
No, certainly not.
On the night Marie disappeared, Jessie Ray had been at the bar with a friend of her father's, Roy Yancey, who also knew Marie Parker. The police decided to ask Roy some questions.
The story that Roy gave was that Marie Parker had in fact been a victim of David Parker Ray, that she had been abducted while she was in the toy box. She was systematically tortured over a period of a couple of days.
How did you come up with the idea to kill Marie?
That was David Ray Parker's idea.
It's pretty remarkable. It just seemed like it went up to a different level, and each level it went up to, it became more overwhelming. And then I began to wonder, where's it going to end?
I know they ended up giving me a rope and telling me to strangle her. And she wasn't dying fast enough.
Okay, but you said she wasn't dying fast enough. Was she struggling, or?
Yeah, she was struggling.
We have no doubt that his statement was accurate. His details were such that it's unquestionable that Roy Yancey killed Marie Parker.
I was told not to tell anybody anything, or I was going to be killed and thrown in the ditch.
And who told you that?
David.
If Roy Yancey could take the police to where Marie Parker's body had been dumped, they'd have the evidence to link Ray to murder, and a much stronger case. Coming up, the search for Marie Parker's body begins in the New Mexico desert.
We felt that if we were able to locate this body, it was going to be a domino effect.
For your free diagnosis.
You're watching MSNBC.
Police had in custody an accomplice of David Parker Ray, Roy Yancey, and Yancey was talking, telling them he could take them to where one of Ray's disappeared victims, Marie Parker, was buried.
Roy was very specific and detailed about the location where this happened. He said pretty well where this was. We felt that if we were able to locate this body, it was going to be a domino effect, and soon this was going to lead to more and more and more. We spent the better part of a week with Roy Yancey going to several different locations. We had 40 people out looking in these areas. We had helicopters out looking in these areas, and still we weren't able to recover a body. And Roy's, hypothesis, which seems to be credible and makes sense, is that David returned to that location after the body had been disposed of and relocated it.
Yet again, David Parker Ray had been meticulous in avoiding detection.
We spent a great deal of time chasing an intelligent man who was well versed in what he was doing and certainly able to cover his tracks very effectively. We were always one step behind him.
Thousands upon thousands of deep, narrow ravines, nooks and crannies, and where do you look? We could be standing above her right now and never know it. And I often wonder how close did we actually come to to her or some of the victims during the course of this.
Roy Yancey pled guilty to second-degree murder, receiving a 20-year sentence. But without a body, and with Ray maintaining his innocence, murder charges would be hard to bring against him.
It's extremely frustrating to know that he's committed murders and yet not have sufficient evidence to bring this matter to a resolution in a court of law. But the fact that we couldn't prosecute him for murder made it all the more important that we successfully prosecute him for the rape, tortures, and kidnappings that we could prove in court that he did.
Yet prosecutors knew that getting a sex crime conviction against Ray would be tough.
Let me say first, in a homicide, you're dealing with the fact that the crime occurred. You don't have to prove that the crime occurred, that you had a willing or unwilling victim. There's a dead body and an unnatural cause of death. There's your homicide. And that, in many senses, and I'm not being facetious, is an easier thing to tell a jury. With a sex crime, you first have to prove to the jury that the crime occurred. You've got a living witness. She's saying that something happened, and it happened without her consent. So it's an entire different process, and there are many prosecutors who tell you right out they would try 50 murder cases to every sexual assault case. It's a different kind of case.
But with no bodies, prosecutors had no choice but to try Ray for the kidnapping and sexual torture of Kelly Van Cleve. The trial began on June 29, 2000. Ray's fate now lay in the hands and credibility of Van Cleve.
I didn't want to go to court. I didn't want to have to go face him. But I did it. He couldn't be out on the streets any longer. I had to do it. Because I had to do what I could to save other women.
As Kelly took the stand, Ray was just a few feet away.
He was just sitting there with a smug look on his face. And it pissed me off. He acted like he was totally innocent and he had done nothing wrong. I didn't want to cry and let him know how much he hurt me. I didn't want to be his victim. That was difficult.
Kelly explained what she could remember of her ordeal in the toy box, but under cross-examination, she was attacked rigorously.
The defense point of view has to be, in this case, that she's not a credible witness and therefore should not be believed because she couldn't remember what happened.
You sit up there on the stand and wonder, are these guys going to believe me?
David's story was that she came over quite willingly, that they had some beers, and that she had consensual sex, that the sex became kinkier as she stayed longer, and that he cleaned her up and sent her home at the end of it.
It is what is known as the blame the victim defense.
Blame the victim techniques have often worked well. Again, if juries can criticize some aspect of the victim's conduct, and that goes from, in the old days, the way she was dressed, whether she voluntarily ingested drugs, whether she had sex for money, whether she wasn't a choir girl, that will often, especially in a case where there's a sexual element and a view that you as the defense attorney can convince the jury that this young woman willingly went with the offender, that can be a big hurdle against conviction.
Just lies. I think that was the most difficult part, was all the lies that they said. I could have faced David without the lies.
The defense's claims that Kelly had consented to be in the toy box were directly contradicted by Ray on his own audio tape.
You are obviously here against your will. You'll be raped thoroughly and repeatedly.
But there was a problem. Kelly could not recall Ray playing her the tape, so the judge ruled the audio tape inadmissible as evidence.
The suppression of the audio tape weakened our case because they were not able to hear David's actual planning, preparation, and his own voice.
You're going to be kept like an animal. As far as I'm concerned, you're a pretty piece of meat.
The prosecution did have one more weapon to draw on, the video footage of Ray with Kelly in the toy box. But what the tape showed was subject to interpretation.
When you look at the tape, you see that there's no evidence of injury because he's not beating her. He's touching her gently. He caresses her breast. He lightly rubs her stomach. He lightly rubs her arms. She was able to sit there and loosen up her joints and the way you would if you'd done something strenuous. And that was our interpretation of the tape.
I knew the defense was going to try to turn everything around on me. But I didn't think that with the tape, I figured everybody would know. Everybody could see I wasn't there willingly.
What jurors saw was a defendant who didn't look like a criminal, much less a sexual sadist.
David sitting in the courtroom that entire time, looking very normal, looking very respectful, looking very non-threatening.
After a 2-week trial, the jury retired to consider whether Kelly's testimony and the video were enough to find Ray guilty.
Kelly's the one who the jury has to believe in order for them to return a guilty verdict. I didn't think there was going to be any way that a jury would come back with a not guilty verdict in this.
When they finally made a decision and everybody got back to the courtroom, I knew it was going to be a guilty verdict. It had to have been a guilty verdict. They fooled me.
On July 13th, 2000, the jury announced they were unable to reach a verdict. 2 female jurors did not buy Kelly's testimony. The judge declared a mistrial. Coming up, the state retries the Ray case with a new judge, a new jury, and new evidence.
We tested her credibility in the fire of cross-examination and trial twice. Her life must have been hell.
I think it was harder the second time than it was the first time.
Nine months after David Parker Ray's first trial ended with a hung jury, a retrial got underway.
No prosecutor wants to do a retrial of a case. There are a lot of reasons, but basically, you've ideally given this your best shot, so things rarely improve the second time around.
But this time, a new judge ruled that Ray's audio tape was relevant to the case.
Hello there. You probably think you're going to be raped, and you're sure right about that.
I remember hearing his voice, and it sends shivers down my spine.
As far as I'm concerned, you're a pretty piece of meat. Be smart and be a survivor. Have a nice day.
The second trial judge had an entirely different view of that evidence and ruled differently than the first one. It was a very powerful piece of evidence.
This was essentially a confession.
While the audio tape was a crucial piece of evidence, the case still relied on the personal testimony of Kelly Van Cleve.
We tested her credibility in the fire of cross-examination and trial twice. Her life must have been hell.
I think it was harder the second time than it was the first time, because I had already been there. I already had to tell my story to thousands of people I didn't know. And that first jury didn't believe me.
On April 16, 2001, after a week-long trial, the second jury retired to deliberate.
I was sweating. I didn't know what they were going to say. I had no idea.
Would this jury believe Kelly's story?
We got guilty. And he got 224 years in prison. And then we partied.
Do you believe Kelly's version of events was true?
So the question is whether I believe that She was abducted by the Ray family and held captive and raped and tortured. Yeah, I believe it.
But you're his defense attorney. You seem to be saying that your client is guilty.
I do seem to be saying that, don't I?
In a deal with prosecutors, David Parker Ray pled guilty to kidnapping and second-degree rape in the case of the young woman who escaped the Toybox.
I knew that not everybody I would ever defend would be innocent. I knew that some of the people that I represented would be truly bad people. And I believe that on the spectrum of people who do not belong in society, David Parker Ray is right in there.
With Ray now convicted and in jail, and agreeing to talk with profiler Mary Ellen O'Toole, the FBI hoped to get him to open up and tell them where the bodies were.
We felt that over time, though, with more interviews, we would have been able to get him to tell us more about the prior crimes. But unfortunately, he died of a heart attack going to state prison.
Before his sudden death, Ray had served only 8 months of his 224-year sentence. The American legal system had been severely tested by the Ray case. In the end, was justice done?
I think to get this torturer and murderer off the streets certainly was justice being done. To have him found guilty by a jury finally was a triumph in the courtroom. So it was justice in that sense.
Was justice done? I don't think justice can ever be done in these types of cases. What David did to these women, no amount of punishment to him can take away what those women have to live with.
David took too much of me away. I feel like I'm a totally different person. I don't go anywhere. I don't trust anybody. I miss the old me. The one that used to be wild and crazy and sassy and wasn't scared. I would do just about anything to get the old me back. I wish he wouldn't have died. I want him alive. I would ask him why. Why me? Why did he take me home? Why didn't he kill me? I wish he was still alive so he could tell us what happened to all those other girls, where he buried them, how he killed them, so those other families could have some closure.